So it's about time I cover Warlock DPS for single target. I've done this with pretty much all the other classes previously. You can check back on those videos. However, I still have to update Barbarian and Wizard Module 28 setups. But here on Warlock we have the HELLBRINGER, and well, many of you may be disappointed to realize that Warlock's actually on the bottom of the pile of classes with single target damage. And my tests definitely come out with showing that. Now believe me, I've spent many hours across multiple different days testing out Warlock single target DPS, figuring out what's good, what's bad, and ultimately what you should be using to maximize its damage. And with all that effort, we still cannot get above any of the other classes in just raw single target damage. Any of you who's played Warlock for a long time will probably already know about this. Warlock suffers in pure single target boss fights, particularly in burst damage. You just lack the raw magnitudes compared to any other class. And then along came the Insignia bonus, Tactician's Precision, which has made classes like the Wizard be able to output like 4 extra encounter powers versus Warlock, where you basically gain next to nothing from this. You already have so much cooldown reduction. Your artifact call was already stuffed full with encounter powers. So as of late, Warlock really has not had a lot of good things going for it. However, do not be mistaken. Warlock damage dealer is very good when you're in mixed fights, particularly when the enemies have lots of hit points and they stick around long enough for the dots to kick in of Warlock. So you'll see content like the Moondancer trial. Warlocks will do very well, but you jump into trials like Zemnitz's Reliquary and you'll see they'll fall behind pretty quickly compared to any other class, especially when you push to the maximum of like speed runs. They just lack all sorts of burst damage. You'll get about like 36 million damage, maybe 40 million tops in an artifact call versus other classes getting above 70 million. Now this is set with my DPS rules. When you're outside of that, you'll find you can do a lot more damage when you prioritize getting certain damage buffs, particularly in certain content, and then getting all the extra team buffs. Ultimately, we're using all of these rules here, and we do that with all the different classes, and we're using the buffer artifact to simulate all those different buffs you would get from being in a team and having artifact calls. Otherwise, these tests would not be representative at all of party content. If we left this out, all it would be showing you is your own damage per second based on yourself. And then you jump into a group, and even if you know how to perform well by yourself, you might perform super poorly when you don't take into consideration the vital importance of artifact calls, where you basically do like 3 times the more amount of damage. Anyway, enough said, let's jump into Warlock and what you should be using and what I found works the best. And ultimately that, yeah, Warlock is the bottom of the pile and could well do with some improvements. You can check back on previous videos and I have talked at length about what powers you should be using. And there's no real competition compared to Blades, Killing Flames, and Hellfire Ring. If you are to argue to use anything else, you probably just don't realize how Warlock really works. No offense meant, but again, I highly recommend going back and checking out this video in particular, where I explain all the powers. I spend over 11 minutes doing so. And if I were to add this to this video, it would just make it that much more longer. There's a bunch of bugs and ultimately people always miss. Blades is going to do 50% more damage, multiplicative against enemies with curse. Killing Flames, that's a pretty dead easy one. Yes, it's your highest single target damaging power. And then Hellfire Ring. Many of you might be confused why you use it. And that is to trigger Power of the 9 Hells to get your risky investment. And when you even compare the damage versus it to what other powers you could be using, it still comes out on top. Warlock seriously needs some updating with their abilities. Like, why does Hatter's Grasp only have 300 magnitude? And it's a single target power. Ultimately, this is pretty much the setup you would use on Warlock. Now, there are a few variations and I have gone and tested them. And this is what we find in terms of the DPS. The best I could get is just over 1.2 million encounter DPS, which if you look back on any of my other videos, it's the worst compared to any class. And at this point, we have tested all of them. You may argue on certain different uses with regards to class features, and just ultimately, there's nothing better than, say, Dust to Dust, and then you can use Flames of Empowerment. I would highly recommend No Pity No Mercy just for the reliable uptime of combat advantage. You're running content, it's not a dummy test, enemies will move around. So having this could result in a bit more damage gain than, say, Flames of Empowerment, which we're using here on the dummy again to just gain an ever so slight bit of a bonus. Also, having No Pity No Mercy means you could just use Hellish Rebuke all the time and not worry about using, say, Hand of Blight and not have to worry about being melee. But this is, like, what I found in my test the most effective. To go with that Hand of Blight and then a Hellish Rebuke every 10 seconds to maintain its dot effect to give you like soul sparks over time. And this does not require any animation cancelling at all. Some of you who are big advocates of animation cancelling might argue that it's a must-have to play Warlock, and it's really not. This bottom test here is animation cancelling Hellish Rebuke, and we got less damage than just switching over to Hand of Blight and using a Hellish Rebuke every 10 seconds. You could argue I could animation cancel some encounter powers a little bit. You can, ever so slightly, and maybe you can get a bit more damage out, but at best you'll probably get maybe 50,000 more DPS, and that's it. That still puts Warlock at a very, very bad position for single target damage. So I don't think anybody out there should be arguing at all that Warlock's in a good spot for single target damage. It just seriously is not and needs updates. The content where it is good is mixed content, because these two encounter powers are both multi-target, combined with your daily power, which is multi-target, along with your Soul Scorch, and nearly your entire setup is multi-target, except Killing Flames and except your at-wills. Like, Warlock is nearly all using multi-target powers in single target because they just don't have anything better. They could use a proper daily power that is single target. Like, you could argue Brood of Hadar is better than Tyrannical Curse. But no, as soon as you take into account the extra damage boost of 15% just makes this better than, say, using Brood of Hadar. They did fix Brood of Hadar, so it's pretty tight, it's pretty close. But no, Tyrannical Curse, just that bit better. Again, this is the setup we were using where we found the most amount of damage. You can feel free to switch your at-wills a little bit, it won't matter that much. You could use Eldritch Blast instead of Hand of Blight if you don't want to stay at melee range. But let's jump to the damage test. Feel free to leave your comments below, but definitely, I do not think I could improve upon this much more. So we pre-stacked here. We got all those Investiture stacks giving us 20% damage to our encounter powers. We reset our log there. We're going into the artifact call. We even reduced the boss's hit points down to 70% so that Killing Flames would deal more damage. So yeah, I've done pretty much everything in favor of Warlock to output as much damage as possible, and still it is quite far behind other classes. So we've done the artifact call there, done that rotation, and the rotation, you will see it again, is pretty much starting with your Hellfire Ring, then using your blades, then using your Killing Flames, your Tyrannical Curse, your Mount Power, then you just use your Soul Scorch, then you use your blades again, your Killing Flames, and your Soul Scorch. Now, some people may argue not to use the Soul Scorch within the artifact call. However, I found its raw damage versus the damage buff it gives you makes it actually worth it to cast in the artifact call. When you actually just look at the data and the math, you'll see that the diminished gain of the damage buffs is just going to be not as good as just the raw damage you could be dealing with your Soul Scorch, rather than just sitting around and doing an at-will and waiting on your cooldowns. Also, just having them cast sooner, like using the Soul Scorch, means you're immediately being able to cast blades again, means that you can get as many hits as possible from the blades within the artifact call, which is very important. So here we can't see the DPS in the bottom right corner because I forgot to switch that on, the mini parser, but I will show the log at the end and you can see everything checks out. But here we're 20 seconds out from the next artifact call, and you're pretty much just making sure every 10 seconds to use your Hellish Rebuke, and then it's Hand of Blight at will, and when your encounter powers are off cooldown, you use them. So here's the next artifact call. Artifact, Hellfire Ring, Blades, Killing Flames, Tyrannical Curse, your Mount Power. We did use the Soul Scorch, I believe, before that because the Mount Power still had a second on cooldown, and it's just not worth waiting in these DPS tests or you just lose damage. And yeah, the following rotation there again. And you can see that rotation in my DPS list there as well, the exact order of what you should be using. But ultimately, when you're outside the artifact call, you're basically getting the pips. You want to get 3 of them, and then you cast it, and then you cut the cooldowns of your encounters. Like here, use your Soul Scorch, then you're using your blades and your Killing Flames. And you want to prioritize your blades and your Killing Flames. It does not matter so much about your Hellfire Ring. As long as you have one out, they last for 7 seconds, 8 seconds, and then they're just going to do their damage over time. It doesn't really matter you casting another one on top of it. So you don't prioritize that. Always prioritize your blades and your Killing Flames. And this is the last artifact call right here, getting the boss dummy nearly killed and then dismissing him and ending the log. And we end up with that 1.177 million encounter DPS. However, an unfortunate thing was that our mount did not crit. And I didn't want to go back so many times to keep retesting this. Like, I've already spent hours and hours and hours trying to get a perfect log. Every time it was like, my daily didn't crit once, my mount didn't crit once, I screwed up some timing and added a few seconds, and that just makes you lose so much damage. But yeah, if it did crit, when we compare versus our other tests, we'd gain about like nearly 35,000 DPS, and we end up at that 1.206 million encounter DPS. And that's the log here with your Killing Flames coming out on top. And again, that's a little bit inflated because we're starting with the boss dummy at already like 65%. And this deals more damage the less HP your enemy has. I will say, if you do want to super min-max, there is a way to get like Killing Flames 3 times with an artifact call. You do need like 2 Tactician's Precision, which I cannot achieve because there's no mount with that yet. No other mount I can obtain. But otherwise, you could stack recharge speed to like nearly 50% and maybe get it. Just keep in mind you're getting 15% from the Scintillant set. You can get another 15% from Blessed Advantage, which is actually pretty cool. You can obtain this by yourself because you're summoning your Soul Puppet, and each time you do so, you heal it. And that heal can trigger Blessed Advantage. Many of you may not have known that, but that's some pretty good free recharge speed and power if you were to make the most of it. But I will confidently say, I cannot get much more DPS than this on Warlock. My build is completely maxed out at the DPS requirements. With all of these, we have reliable 90% stats and all of the rest of the stuff here. We did super well on timing, like 3 minutes and 14 seconds is very good. I do not usually get less than that. Like, the best it possibly could be would be 3 minutes and 10 seconds. But since we also have to pre-stack and then reset the log and then go and attack, you already have the log starting before you've cast your artifact, and that way it adds on like a few extra seconds. But hopefully that is at least somewhat insightful of how to play Warlock DPS. Again, here is the list. You can see the exact artifact call rotation, and you need to follow that to output this much damage. If you aren't doing that proper order and not having Tactician's Precision, you will lose a lot of damage. Again, some may argue not to use Soul Scorch, and I just found it's worth it because the amount of damage that outputs there, like 9% of your overall damage, it's definitely worth it to use in an artifact call when you can get out some big hits there along with some damage over time, which is all buffed up with the effectiveness. I did compare some data versus doing artifact calls with it and without it, and just found using it led me to do more damage. Again, you also then can cut the cooldown of blades and have it deal more damage as well. Potentially, if you have 2 tacticians, you might not need to use Soul Scorch at all, or you have cast all your encounter powers and use Soul Scorch at the end. But it does have a damage over time effect, so it can be worth it to get that for the artifact called too. Ultimately, I totally think Warlock needs some love. It needs some improvements and updates for that single target damage. It's super solid within multi-target, not much problems there, but for single target, it falls behind every other class. It needs some proper solid single target powers, like you're using Hellfire Ring because you kind of have to for getting risky investment, and then you're using blades because there's nothing better. This is like nearly 600 magnitude and there's nothing that beats that on this cooldown. Again, for reliability, totally just use No Pity No Mercy instead of Flames of Empowerment. That's just an incy weensy tiny little boost that, because we aren't like using Hellish Rebuke non-stop, then we aren't really using it for this extra soul sparks. We're just using, say, Hand of Blight for its soul sparks, with then the passive Hellish Rebuke soul spark gain. There was not much need for me to use it in the test. We did use it for this test here, where again you're only using Hellish Rebuke. We were having that there. For multi-target, sure, you could use a variety of different abilities, but for single target, there's not much arguing that there's anything better than these. A massive thank you to all these channel members for their added support, and we'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.